Hey, good afternoon. Dr. Alan Christensen here with you. Welcome to Office Hours Live. So we're at Monday, August 1st. I'm with you guys on Instagram and on Facebook and on YouTube. So good to connect today. So Office Hours Live, if you've been here before, welcome back. If you're new, we'll cover top questions of yours and also some updates. Topics I like to cover are really about thyroid disease, endocrinology, hormones, weight loss, that sort of stuff, healthy food, things along those lines. So I'm seeing a lot of folks jump on here already. Welcome aboard. I'm keeping tabs on questions that come up. So I've got a few topics I'll cover from the very beginning, and then I'll grab a few of your questions. And as far as questions go, details are good. You can ask easy questions to Google and get a lot of stuff you'll find wherever, but I want to give you something you wouldn't hear otherwise. I want to take it to greater levels of detail. So don't be afraid. Put in all the details and let's see if this can be useful for you. I'm seeing some familiar friends here on already. So yeah, welcome back. Good to see you guys. Say hi and say where you're from. We tend to see people from all over the world. I'm in northern Minnesota. Joanne's with us here. I'm seeing some other folks on Instagram come up. FM Vic. Yeah, I always don't know proper names with Instagram handles. So, but good to see everyone. San Diego, yeah, coming from all over. Oh, more from California. Lori's from California here too. Illinois, Michigan. So yeah, more and more coming on. Always curious to hear where you're from. Charlottesville, Philadelphia. Oh, Felicia. Okay, I think you've told me that before. So my apologies for not staying caught up. Joanne's in Maryland. Yeah. Karen and I moved in June, and we're now in the big North Woods and settling in here and really enjoying it. Someone else is here from Minnesota. So yeah, welcome. And Austin. So yeah, all over the place. So yeah, top questions. So there was one paper I wanted to share with you guys. This was a newer one, and it was about the relevance of lactose intolerance on thyroid health. So yeah, thoughts about dairy food. Do you eat dairy food now? Do you avoid dairy food? Has dairy given you problems? Do you use dairy substitutes? What do you think about dairy food? And dairy food, in writing the last book, I realized that mammal dairy would probably be a more accurate way to think about it, because all the milk from a mammal is pretty similar in terms of how it affects us. So cows, sheep, goats, it's mostly cow's milk, right? But there are times to where there's goat's cheese or sheep's milk products or even camel products that are out, and they're pretty much all the same, good or bad, right? So I'm seeing questions pop up too, and I got a couple already that I will address. Looking to see if thyroid levels are in optimal range. Someone saying you must be in Bemidji, Monsbeck. Yeah, I mentioned being in Minnesota. We will be in Bemidji tomorrow. We're going to go visit some my parents and help them out, but we're a little ways away from that. We're not too far, but yeah, kind of middle of nowhere. So, and with the questions, one other thing is that when you guys ask something, I love to follow up with questions that are on a related theme, and I love to get more details. So I'm going to talk a bit about this whole lactose dairy thing a bit more, but I'm watching to get some good questions for afterward. And one that might be really good, Lynette is looking to see if my thyroid levels are in optimal range. Lynette, if you want to give more details as I'm talking about the topic, and put what your levels were. And if there were related health concerns or things you were told about those thyroid levels, I'd be more than happy to help make sense out of that to you. So yeah, feel free to throw in some more detail. I will keep my eye out for that. And I saw another one. Felicia is asking about thyroid function and brain function. There was a news story not too long ago about thyroid disease and dementia. And I don't know if that was what inspired the question, or Felicia, or if you're wondering about that for other reasons. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that as well. If there's more details on why you were concerned about thyroid and brain function, put those up too. And I'll come back to that one in just a minute as well. So a couple of good questions here already. Oh, here's a great one as well. Can thyroid increase your cholesterol? Yeah, we'll cover that one. They can certainly relate. In fact, a quick teaser on that one. Cholesterol tests were first used to evaluate thyroid function. Yeah, before we knew anything about the relationship to heart disease, we knew there was a big connection between cholesterol and thyroid function. So good one. So Dairy, I'll mention this quickly. There was a study that was done, and let me just get the details top of mind again, get this in front of me here. Yeah, this one it just came out a few weeks ago, and it was looking at the prevalence of lactose intolerance on patients with Hashimoto's thyroiditis and how that affected their dosage of thyroid medication. So the prevalence, like how common lactose intolerance was with them. So lactose, dairy foods are pretty simple formulas, actually. So milk is basically lactose, casein, whey, and a whole bunch of water. That's all that there really is in milk. It's just those few things. Now, lactose is a disaccharide, Di, so it's a 2-molecule sugar. It's a glucose and a galactose that are stuck together. A lot of us can't get them unstuck. we lack enough lactase, which is the enzyme that pulls apart lactose. And if we can't pull it apart, water gets stuck all around it. And that water gets carried into our intestinal tract, and it can make us bloated, miserable, get diarrhea. It can do all those sorts of things. So the question was, how common was lactose intolerance in those with thyroid disease? And did it affect how their medication was working for them? And what they found was that actually just about 60%, 60% of those with Hashimoto's were found to have lactose intolerance. So where do we find lactose? Well, milk, ice cream, a lot of soft cheeses have it. There's some in yogurt. There's not much of it there's some in butter as well. There's not much lactose in hard cheese. There's not much lactose in cottage cheese, but most of their dairy products have varying amounts of lactose. And it seems there's a threshold for those who are intolerant that smaller amounts tend not to cause symptoms, but then above some threshold, then they do cause symptoms. And that seems to be around 5,000 milligrams, or about 5 grams. So most people who are intolerant can have a little bit and do okay, but above some amount, they feel it and they get pretty bad gas and bloating. So this study showed that, yeah, it was quite common that 60%, the majority of those with Hashimoto's, had lactose intolerance. What they found, though, and this was different from other studies, it didn't seem to affect how the medications worked. So they looked at their use of medications with and without lactose. And if they had lactose intolerance and they took medicine with lactose, it didn't seem to absorb worse than if they didn't have lactose intolerance or if they took a medicine without lactose. And why would that be? Well, it seems that the amount of lactose in the medicine was probably so low, it didn't make a big difference for these people. And there was other studies that showed the same data with a different outcome. Another study from a few years ago showed that liquid thyroid medicine that was free in lactose could absorb better for those with lactose intolerance. So this is a possibility. If you are lactose intolerant, this could be a factor for you, but not necessarily. There are those who don't tolerate lactose, but medicines with lactose don't seem to be an issue for them. So it could go either way. But lactose intolerance is quite common. So if you do have Hashimoto's and you do have tendencies towards especially irregular stools, this study looked at different symptoms, including gas and bloating and a few others. And gas and bloating, oddly, was common both in those with lactose intolerance and those without, like exactly the same. Both 50% of both groups had gas and bloating. So lactose intolerance didn't predict it more so than just having a stomach predicted it, but it did strongly predict irregularity. So tendencies towards constipation or diarrhea. So yeah, if you've got that, might be worth avoiding. If you follow my work, you might know that dairy foods are also very high in iodine, which can also be a big factor, but more things to think about that way. So some good questions have come in already. Several more. So Lori talking about milk, use soy milk, no dairy. Yeah, Lori. And whenever I hear people say that, there's always many that think, well, what about soy and thyroid? I promise it's just not an issue. There are those that have soy allergy, but soy foods don't have any measurable effects on thyroid function in any of the studies that have been done, and many have been done. So yeah, no worries about that. There are many other plant-based milks that many do like. And by and large, the plant-based milks are all low in iodine, and the lactose problems don't apply to them either. But yeah, soy is one of several good options. Okay, so lots of good questions. I had a few other things I could have done beforehand too, but there were so darn many good questions already. I want to dive into some of these. Now, again, I'm with you guys on a couple platforms. I'm with you on Facebook Live. I'm with you here on Instagram and also on YouTube. So I've got a few good ones on Instagram I'm going to start with, and I'm going to move from those first. So this was the person who asked about her thyroid levels were in optimal range. Let me see if you put some of your numbers in. Any more details on that? Not just yet, but someone else asked a similar question. What is the optimal TSH range for someone with Hashimoto's and benign nodules? So let's talk a little bit about optimal ranges. Well, some of this will differ, and so I'll talk about adults, right? So let's talk about 18 through 65 for starters. So adults age 18 through 65, and then we'll talk about TSH, free T3, thyroid antibodies, reverse T3, all that stuff. Briefly, I'd like to mention that the T3 and T4, that they can fluctuate a fair amount in healthy people. There's a popular view in natural medicine that you need to have T3 in the high end of the range, or it's got to be above range. And I get the logic behind that, but when we look at groups of healthy people and those free of thyroid disease, they don't have high levels of T3. They've got a big range of T3. And they actually tend to have more low normal T4 levels. So I don't find data supporting that. But there is a lot of data showing that the normal TSH is not the same as the TSH in healthy people. That's the one that has the biggest difference. So I'll focus the rest of the discussion on it. So basically, healthy people have a low normal TSH. And most adults between about ages 18 and 65 that don't have thyroid problems, their TSH runs between about 0.5 to 1.5, somewhere around there. Now, one thing to know is that if you retest your TSH, it'll never be exactly the same, even if everything else is the same. There's about a 1 to 1.5 point variance that's just purely random on a TSH score. So when I talk about a range that's only a point wide, it's worth knowing that you may not always stay in that range. It's really if you're averaging in that range or not. If you see yourself a little bit outside that range, it might not be worth yet making an alarm or trying to make a dose adjustment, because it could just be some fluctuation. If you're way out, like more than a point outside of that window, and you're trending that way further, then that gets to be significant. But 0.5 to 1.5 is a starting place. Some guidelines will say like 0.5 to 2. So somewhere around there is a good starting place. Now, some of the factors that make that different, being over 65. You would allow an extra point for being well over 65. Having heart disease, you could also let it be a little higher. Being pregnant. Each trimester is different, but as a generalization, there's a little more range of normal, especially on the low side. So during pregnancy, being below normal is not as significant as it would be otherwise. And the other thought then is managing nodules or past thyroid cancer. In some of those cases, you want the TSH to be a little below 1. You want it to be slightly on the lower side. So those are a few nuances of that. And if someone has more details about their specific levels, being good or bad, happy to give more general input on that. Of course, can't diagnose or treat per se, but happy to give input on that. So related to that question, I'm seeing one I want to address. Someone's saying that T3, this is I Hate Hills. I've seen you before several times. Welcome back. T3 and T4, low end of normal, taking 90 milligrams of Armour, and the TSH is 0.1. My doctor doesn't want to up my prescription to get to be mid-range. Iodine is red flagged low. What can I do? So I mentioned before briefly about how T3 and T4, there's a popular idea that they should be mid-range or high. No, that's just not a valid goal based upon how these scores look in healthy people. Now your TSH is low, and there's a backward relationship, right, between the TSH and the T3 and T4, but that only holds true at the extremes, and you're not that far along yet. It's very common to have a TSH below range and low T3, low T4. The most common reason for that is your body's trying to protect itself. Your body's trying to get rid of all that extra thyroid hormone. So you're getting rid of it. And that makes T3 and T4 low while the TSH is low. Now, other things can cause that. I can't diagnose just for anyone specifically here, but that's the most common scenario by far. And a lot of doctors are confused by that. And you said also 70 years old. So I mentioned before about being over 65, a low TSH being more worrisome. So altogether, not a healthy thing. Now you mentioned serum iodine being flagged as low. I've written a lot on iodine testing. Serum or blood levels of iodine have no relationship whatsoever between the iodine in your thyroid or the iodine in your bloodstream. It's not your nutritional iodine status. So serum iodine is not a valid tool that shouldn't be used. It is valid to gauge possible toxicology of iodine. And that comes up almost exclusively for people who are on a medication called amiodarone. That's one where there's so much iodine, it's past how much the kidneys can clear it. And sometimes those levels are best revealed by the serum scores. But other than that, serum iodine, it's completely meaningless and misleading. So it has no bearing upon your scenario. Yeah, you're welcome to Google Alan Christensen iodine testing. I have referenced that, explained that in crazy detail. But blood tests of iodine are not useful. Okay, so lots more really good questions. Let me grab a few more. Try to get some related ones or ones that come up earlier along. Now, I saw one that I wanted to address going back again. Let me look for related ones first. Yeah, here's the exact same one. From not the exact same one, but pretty much from Molly. No matter how much I increase my armor, my T4 and T3 stay the same, low normal. I have never had a TSH above 2. I have done the low iodine diet with no changes in recommendations. Yes, you don't expect your T3 and T4 to be high normal. Let go of that goal. That's not a good goal. The only way that'll happen is if you take too much medication and put yourself at risk. Easy peasy. So here's how that idea came about, though. There's been a lot of data sets saying that healthy people have a low TSH, low normal, not below range, but low normal. And many doctors were trained that if the TSH is low, the T3 and T4 should be high. Well, that's only true at the extremes. It's only true when if you're at a massive overdose, eventually your T3 and T4 go high. Or if you're severely hypothyroid, eventually T3 and T4 go low. But eventually, so the sensitivity difference between TSH and T3 and T4 is 50-fold, 50 times. So for every 100-point changes in a TSH, there's a 2-point change in T3 or T4. So you'll never push up T3 and T4 unless you shove TSH way, way, way down. That's not healthy. That's not safe. So it's not about how to do it better. It's to just let go of that goal. You shouldn't expect to have T3 and T4 on the high. It just doesn't happen for healthy people. Okay. Let's see. Boy, simple one here. Well, I want to get to one that I saw before. Yeah, I saw one that someone asked one and put in some more detail. Here we go. So this was from Felicia, and she was asking more about just thyroid levels and brain function. And someone else, that same one too, but thyroid levels and brain function. When hyperthyroid, can you potentially have brain fog, low mood, etc.? How do thyroid hormones play a role in that? Yes, so a big recent study that was published in a lot of big media journals showed just that hyperthyroidism correlates with dementia, meaning greater risk for lasting harm to brain function, but also temporary cognitive decline, meaning that while one is hyperthyroid, their brain may not work as well, but it could be reversible when high thyroid levels are corrected. So what is hyperthyroidism? How does it first show up? It first shows up as a TSH below range. That's stage 1 subclinical hyperthyroidism. And the paradox about thyroid levels, this is a big one. Too much and too little, they can look identical. And that's because your body works so hard to buffer these hormones and keep them just right. If you've got too much, you may fight the extra, and it may feel like there's too little because you're fighting it. So, and when there's too little, you may hold on to it so much that in some ways it feels like too much. And that's why some people who are hypothyroid can feel anxious or have their heart race. And that's why many who are hyperthyroid can feel too tired or gain weight more easily. But yes, thyroid hormones, the balance of them for brain function needs to be precise. And here's one that's going to surprise some people. One of the more critical thyroid hormones for brain function is reverse T3. Our brain cells cannot mature and function properly without the right amounts of reverse T3. It's a good thing in the brain to have some. So whenever there's an imbalance in too much or too little, the brain can be affected. And this is true for many hormones and nutrients. The chemical balance that allows your muscles to contract doesn't have to be all that precise. But for your brain to work well, has to be very precise. So for your brain to work well enough to keep your heart beating, not all that tough. But for your brain to work well enough for you to feel good and have good recall and good memory, that's just dialed in. That's when things are all right on. So when thyroid hormones are off in any way, yes, brain function can be badly altered. Okay, many, many good questions. Let's see. This is a tricky one. I'm just kind of picking, there's a lot of good questions here. So here's one from Janet. Janet, I'm curious to know if you're here, please give some more details. If you've done the metabolism research, if you're familiar with that. Janet's saying, I've been working hard to reverse my insulin resistance. I've been learning a lot from the CGM. That's a continuous glucose monitor, if you're not familiar with that. It's a device that one can wear. It can give them glucose readings every minute or so throughout the course of several days. I've been surprised by some of my responses to whole, clean foods, such as green beans, squash, all fruits, potatoes. Realize everyone will have an increase when they eat these foods, but how much is too much? What constitutes a spike? How much is too much? I'm confused as to whether I should eat these great for me foods. Janet, yeah, this is a really good question about the continuous glucose monitors. They're really seeing popularity right now. And it's so true that when your glucose is way outside of a range, your health is worse. But you're asking the exact right question. Does a blip in your glucose mean the food is bad for you? If your glucose is catastrophically elevated for long periods of time, and that causes a change to your glucose attached to your red blood cells, then it's a problem. So that's called your hemoglobin A1C. Your red blood cells live about 3 months. Their outer coating gets glucose stuck to it. And so how much percent glucose your red blood cells are is really how likely you are to have harm from your blood sugar being high. And for diabetics, if they have big changes in their blood sugar, they generally have higher levels of A1C. Now, it's the A1C that matters. It's not the fluctuations in blood sugar by themselves. And in diabetes, the CGMs first became really exciting, and we thought this would completely revolutionize diabetes care. Then what we learned was that when we micromanage people's blood sugar by their CGMs, it didn't help their outcomes. In fact, very closely monitored blood sugar that pushed them down to a lower range caused higher rates of death and mortality. So it came on the scene fast and heavy diabetes world, and then kind of went by the wayside when it was found that it wasn't as useful as it was thought. Now, there are many contexts where CGMs can be great for diabetes care. I'm not saying they're not good. But the idea that we have to micromanage every minute of our blood sugar, and if we do, we're healthier, that's kind of gone by the wayside in research. But it's still now flourishing in the popular world. So Janet, your insulin resistance, I'm not sure why you say you have insulin resistance. If you want to put more details about that, I'm happy to address them. We do suspect that to be the case when serum insulin is very high and or the ratio between HDL and triglycerides is off. So the question is, what is insulin resistance? What causes it? Why does it happen? What does it mean? The big concept I'd love you guys to have is that insulin resistance is not a disease. It's not an error. It's an adaptive mechanism. So when your body has so much fuel, so much fat, carbs, ketones, whatever mixture of those things, when there's too much of those, your body blocks them from getting into your cells. And it does that by plugging its ears and trying to ignore insulin. So it's an intentional response. It's a safety switch. It's a good thing. So when it happens, it's not how do you battle insulin, it's how do you get the body back to a lower fuel state? How do you get out of the state of fuel excess? And that was really why I wrote the Metabolism Reset Diet. So the whole solution that's outlined in that, the Metabolism Reset Challenge, basically, that's how you help that. So yeah, I'm going to look to see, Janet, if you have follow-up comments. Looks like not just yet, but I'll watch for those. But yeah, insulin resistance is not a bad thing. It's your body protecting itself. And all those foods you mentioned, the green beans, the squash, the potatoes, the fruits. Now, potatoes, there's like healthy boiled potatoes and there's French fries, not the same thing. But yeah, they're healthy foods. Oh, great. Here's some feedback. Janet, I've wanted to do the metabolism reset diet, but I just can't do shakes. I'd welcome alternate suggestions. I have it fasting blood sugar almost consistently above 100 and last A1C before diet adjustments 5.7. So Janet, those two findings don't diagnose insulin resistance. That's what's called impaired fasting glucose. So, or ideally we would see fasting glucose in the low 90s or below, and ideally we would see an A1C somewhere below, low fives. But 5.7 and 100, those are not yet places where pathology emerges, and those themselves do not diagnose insulin resistance. As far as the metabolism reset diet, please get the book, Janet. I talk about ways to do it with foods as well. There's options for everyone on that. You can do that with foods. Now, to be candid, there are goals in terms of being low fuel, low carb, low fat, low ketone, and getting enough protein. And those goals are not easy to do with just foods. They're much easier to do with concentrated, purified sources of protein. You can do it with foods, and I do tell you how, but dense sources of protein make that a whole lot easier for you, especially the plant-based proteins that can be used. And I give a lot of recipes for how you can just use any kind of a plant-based protein powder, make those up. And it's 28 days. It's not a forever type thing. So do reconsider that. But you can do the metabolism reset with foods, but do think through if 28 days of doing plant protein shakes might not be the end of the world, if it could reverse those things. So yes, insulin resistance is based upon insulin levels or on other factors. You may or may not have it. Your glucose levels are not ideal. They're not diabetic. They're not even pre-diabetic, but they could be a little lower. And yeah, the metabolism reset diet would be the best way that I know of to get you there. Jen, to put some perspective on that, we've had many people who have A1C scores in the badly diabetic range, like 7, 8, 9, 10, and they can come back to a healthy range within 6 weeks of the metabolism reset diet. So people who have scores of like 5.7, they can quite commonly get to a good range of low fives. But yeah, you don't need to worry about the foods you were talking about based upon your scores on the CGM. Okay, so now we're kind of on a theme here. I'm getting a lot of questions related to the MRD. Let's talk more about those. Well, I'm going to talk about that a bit more. There's one I want to jump into, a lot I want to jump into. Okay, so curious why the resting heart rate goes down from MRD. I'm so intrigued by this. Yeah, Kelly, so great question. So the MRD, the publishers and I thought long and hard on whether this should be called metabolism reset or liver reset, because the whole issue about slow metabolism, easy weight gain, difficult weight loss, it's all about liver health and liver function. So what happens is the liver gets gummed up with triglycerides. If that gets far enough along, we call that fatty liver. At milder stages, we call it nothing because it's not regarded, even though it's a real problem. But when that happens, the blood coming through your lower body up to your liver, back to your heart is restricted. And your heart has to beat harder because of that. So many, many things affect one's resting heart rate, but one of the more changeable factors is just how much gunk is in your liver. And by gunk, I mean fat. And by fat, I mean triglycerides. So that's what builds up in the liver more than anything. That's what makes the blood not come back through it easily. And that pushes your resting heart rate up higher. And that's why so many people who do the reset, they find their resting heart rate is lower. Now, aerobic fitness also helps that because it helps your heart, but also because it also makes your liver less resistant. So I'm looking for follow-up comments. My resting heart rate went down almost 20 points. It's amazing, so exciting. Kelly, I don't have the exact numbers top of mind, but in terms of your total mortality risk, every change of just a few beats per minute for your resting heart rate is a change of several percent for total mortality risk. So 20 points, that's like a decade or more on your lifespan. That's a really big deal, and that's super cool. I'm happy to hear about that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So I saw 2 questions about gluten here. So Kelly asked, after MRD, do you recommend always being gluten-free, dairy-free, outside of celiac and lactose tolerance, of course? And someone earlier mentioned about gluten. I'm trying to find that question to make sure I'm covering it well too. I don't see it just yet. I don't want to take too much time, but I did see someone ask a question about gluten being needed for thyroid disease. Let me address those briefly. So yeah, as far as whether you need to be gluten dairy-free after the MRD. So gluten-free, yeah, and you mentioned celiac. So of course, if someone is celiac, they do want to be gluten-free and stay that way. There is a such thing as a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It's actually more rare than celiac diseases. And then there's a wheat allergy. That's like a peanut allergy. That's not subtle. That's like you get hives and you can't breathe. So in those three scenarios, don't eat it. On the other hand, if you say, hey, I feel better when I don't eat gluten, don't eat gluten. That's easy. Now, if none of those things apply to you, I still am not a fan of a lot of commercial baked goods. They're just so high in iodine and lots of other junk. There's enough junk on the labels, and there's a whole lot of junk that's not on the labels. It doesn't have to be labeled. So I'm not a fan of commercial baked goods. But stuff you bake at home, or other versions of wheat that are used, like wheat berries, or other grains that contain gluten, I find no data saying that these things are bad, and mountains of evidence that these things have health benefits. Whole grains are huge factors for offsetting cardiovascular disease. So yeah, I definitely would encourage that. Now, as far as dairy and lactose intolerance, we think here about iodine. Again, dairy is a big source of that. So if you've stabilized your thyroid function, it's gotten better, you're on that maintenance phase, you can probably do fine on a couple of servings, 1 or 2 servings of dairy per day, if you like it, if you digest it. If you don't digest it well and don't prefer it, it's probably not mandatory, but do know that you want to think through your calcium if you're avoiding dairy. It is something that you do need, and there are many other food sources that do have it, but they might take some thought. So those are a few ideas about that. Okay. So here's a quick one. Can you direct any of us who have hyperthyroid to some good resources? I have your Diet Reset book. Yeah, for sure. So that's one of them. I'm going to put a link up here too. The other thing to think about is Hyperthyroid Support. And let's see. I'm just going to get a link for that one. Here we go. Yeah, that's going to be up here. And yeah, that'll be on the thyroid specific formulations page. Take a look at Hyperthyroid Support. And of course, the product itself, but along with the product, there's a lot of discussions on why these ingredients make a big difference for hyperthyroidism. And they do. I've also got a really good article that talks about natural treatments for hyperthyroidism. I'm going to put that up here for you too. I can find it quickly. Let's see. Yep, I got to get a little more in there. Here we go. So hyper, and I should be clear, is generally Graves' disease or toxic nodular goiter. If we're talking about hyper from other causes, other things to consider, yeah, but those are the main ones you want to think about there. Okay, a few more questions. Joanne, what's a good normal resting heart rate? What time of day do you measure it? Yeah, Joanne, get it before you get out of bed in the morning, like first thing, just check it on your radial pulse. And adults, we'd like to see 70 or lower. And that's just a good number. I gave some detailed numbers in Metabolism Reset Guide if you got it sitting around, Joanne, but that's the general starting place for a good target. And yeah, that often does improve during the reset. Okay, aesthetic related question. So how can someone know if their resting heart rate is low due to being fit or due to hypo? Well, if you're hypothyroid, it could be due to that. Yeah. So aesthetic, please give me more clarification because I want to make sure that I address this well. There's being diagnosed with being hypothyroid, there's being diagnosed with having Hashimoto's, and there's currently being in a hypothyroid state. So currently being in a hypothyroid state means your TSH is elevated and your T4 is below range. So in that case, then you are hypothyroid, and that definitely could be lowering your heart rate. So that certainly can be a factor. But if you're treated, or if you're doing natural things such as the thyroid reset diet and your thyroid is stable, you're not currently hypothyroid, even if you had a past diagnosis, so that wouldn't apply to you as being a concern. Aesthetic love. I don't know what I'm diagnosed with. Current TSH is 4, T4 is 1.07. If you wish to put any mention of your thyroid antibodies, I can give feedback on that. So far, your levels are what's considered normal. Now, they're not what most would call optimal. Your TSH is a little higher than optimal, but you're not yet at a state called hypothyroidism. So that wouldn't be affecting your heart rate negatively, but it wouldn't be optimal either. And if you've not already, take a peek at the thyroid reset diet, take a peek at the thyroid reset formulations. Okay, so you've got mild elevations of thyroid peroxidase and thyroglobulin antibodies. So this is very consistent with early Hashimoto's. So yeah, take a look at that same thyroid-specific formulation site. Look at the Hashimoto's bundle as a consideration, and then take a look at the thyroid reset diet. But you've got a really good chance of your TSH moving down, the antibodies staying stable or improving, and things not worsening that way. But you're not currently, you're not at a hypothyroid state with those scores. Okay. Yeah, TPO was 2,500. Yeah, you would have Hashimoto's, and it's much lower now than it was. So that's a positive change, but you're not currently hypothyroid. Let me see if there's one or two more to grab from Instagram. Yeah, someone's asking here also about heart rate. Yes, you do want to see it closer to that 70 range, like you were saying. That's healthier. Okay, here's a great one. Do you recommend the ARD or TRD diet first if you have Hashimoto's, or do both at the same time? Well, if you have Hashimoto's and the antibodies are positive and you're symptomatic from that, focus on the thyroid reset diet. Now, it's actually pretty easy to do both together if you wish, because they're different. So the ARD is the main thing with it is carb cycling. So you're doing healthy carbs, a little bit in the morning, a little bit more at lunch, a little bit more in the evening. That's the main trick to it. The main trick to the thyroid reset diet, of course, is being in the lower spectrum of iodine. And you can easily do both. You can follow the healthy carb cycling with the low iodine foods. And the ARD really doesn't talk about many foods, if any, that aren't already low iodine. The only thing you've got to think about if you're trying to do the adrenal reset or the metabolism reset with the thyroid reset, in the first two books, I did talk about eggs, lower fat cottage cheese, lower fat yogurt as protein sources. And I talked about many options for seafood. Now, those things you've got to think at differently if you're doing the thyroid reset. You can do egg whites, you can do some seafood, there's a list, but you're avoiding dairy. With those few changes, you can get a 2-for-1 for any of those. So hope that was useful. All right, looking through some more. Thoughts on raw dairy? Yeah, not really, still a big source of iodine. There have been a lot of cases of people getting sick from it. So, I mean, I had it a lot as a kid from a farm, not far from where I am now, but not something I would suggest would work differently. Okay, aesthetic love. Do your vitamins with TSH won't move, only antibodies. So if your antibodies came down that much, that's a huge sign. Currently, your TSH is not at a level to where treating with medication would help it. If it stays stable or goes down slowly over the course of years even, you could call that good. Your antibodies are much more predictive of your health and your symptoms right now than your TSH is. So the fact that they went to 2,500 down to 350, that's a huge win. Oh, you're on meds, they don't seem to help. Yeah, I don't know what your levels were before you went on medications. That's a whole different discussion. So if you want to mention that, if you know that, I can give quick feedback on that. But changing your meds wouldn't necessarily help further than what you've done already with lowering your antibodies on the supplements. Let's see. Let me grab just one more. A lot of good questions here. Let's see. Kelly, thank you for doing office hours. So helpful, and you're so great to help us. I've learned so much. Thank you for that, Kelly. And I just saw your comment about how your heart rate was so high for decades. Yeah, your liver issues would be a factor with that. And I don't know how high it was for you, but if it were extremely elevated, we think about other things. But your liver can definitely change it by 20 points or even a few more than that. So that's great to have found that. Oh, Spinder, I just saw your note. I called your Arizona office, but will not be able to go because of the requirement to be seen once a year in person. Yeah, so telemedicine is kind of weird. For a while, it was quite open from state to state. Then it became more restrictive. Now, your other option, I do personal consults, which for those, it doesn't matter where you live personally. And that's at thyroidopinion.com. I've got a few of those still open in the fall. They book out pretty quick. I'm going to drop that link up there. But those are an option for anyone that did wish to consult with me personally. And yeah, where you live is not a restriction. It doesn't matter what part of the country or even what country you're in. I've got a lot of folks from outside the US. But with those, we can speak in person. We can talk about your health, give you a specific game plan, give you input to take back to your current doctors. So those are an option as well, and that can be useful. Okay, aesthetic love. My TSH was 4.92 before meds. So if your other scores were similar, that would be called subclinical hypothyroidism. And I just got done teaching a big group of doctors about this. There have been all these studies showing that if you have subclinical hypothyroidism, meaning your TSH is above range and your T4 has not dropped below range, that can cause fatigue, weight gain. That can cause a risk for heart disease. That can cause various health problems. Totally true. And you would think that by taking medications and moving the TSH down, you would then reverse those problems. But it just doesn't happen. The data is just undeniable that treating subclinical disease with medication doesn't help. People don't feel better. They don't have less heart disease. They don't live longer. It doesn't make a difference at all. So treating naturally, treating with dietary therapy, it's not just a good option, it's really the only viable option. But your TSH has responded, your antibodies have come down. The TSH generally takes longer to fully reset than the antibodies do. So your antibodies have already plummeted. You've already come a long ways under following a few steps. If you're not already very thoroughly on the thyroid reset diet, please dial that in closely, look at any hidden factors, and give that more time. You may be improving quite a bit further. But also talk to your doctor about whether you need the medications or not. Where you were before you were put on them was not what's considered a valid indication for them. They may not be necessary for you to stay on, and they can also worsen symptoms when they're not needed. All right, Joanne, thanks, Dr. C. Because of you, my health is dialed in. That's great news, Joanne. I'm glad to hear you're doing well. Yeah, I got to meet Joanne in person a few years ago, back when I did retreats. And they were so much fun. I have to figure out some way to do something like that again, just in-person type events. But yeah, great to meet her in person, talked a lot over the years, and always happy to hear that you're doing well. So I think that's what we got for tonight. I'm expecting to be back again next week on schedule. So yeah, I'll give some feedback about topics I'll be covering. Oh, I'll give a quick answer to this, and this is an easy one. Kelly had some good questions. Does MRD often help people who are bordering diabetes to reverse this? Heck yeah. And not only that, Kelly, but we really use that mostly in the clinic for reversing those who were just full-on diabetic. So yeah, many can reverse early diabetes or bordering diabetes. And check the scores. The proof is in the pudding that way. But that's something that, type 1 diabetes, insulin-dependent autoimmune, is different. But most adults with type 2, yes, that's a great way to really reverse that. All right, happy Monday. Have a good evening, everyone. And I'll see you guys next week. Stay tuned. Bye-bye.